but you need leadership and you need political leadership. And one of the things I've had to face in my own work is that I could do all this wonderful work as far as I'm concerned. It's wonderful, I enjoy it, and it does have certain implications. But in the end, it's a political problem.
Hello and welcome to A Theory of Everything. I'm Luis Razo, the director of ASEM and host of this channel. Today, I have the honor of talking to Professor Geoffrey West. In my view, Professor West is one of the most important living theoretical physicists. I'll try to explain why in this exchange. Professor West completed his undergraduate studies at Cambridge University and went on to earn a PhD in physics from Stanford. His talents were such that he became the founder and leader of the high-energy physics group at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, where nuclear weapons had been developed during World War II. After his time there, he became president of the Santa Fe Institute, one of the most prestigious science and technology think tanks in the world. In 2006, he was very deservedly named one of Time magazine's top 100 most influential people in the world. Professor West's long-term fascination with the universal scaling laws that pervade all of life parallels the main preoccupation of this channel, which is the symmetry conjectured to exist between the information processing and topology of animal brains and the information processing and topology of the so-called DS correspondence in string theory. His work attempts to quantify the physical structure and dynamics of the life and death of things, including the life and death of organisms, cities, companies, and nations. He's a courageous example of why and how taking a physics approach to these big questions has important implications for long-term survival and human flourishing, all of which is especially relevant in an age where so much of what we've been led to believe about social and political organization seems to be crumbling before our very eyes. Professor West, it's an honor to welcome you. Thank you very much for talking to me today.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you for that very flattering introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. If it's okay, I'd like to begin with a question that I ask most of my guests. And I ask this question because I think it serves to contextualize any serious discussion. And I think it's especially relevant in this case because of who you are and because of our general situation as a species. Would you agree or disagree that the worst thing that could possibly happen from a human perspective is for humanity to go prematurely extinct?
Well, that's a huge question, of course, and very provocative. Well, because you put in that dependent clause, from a human's perspective, I suppose the answer is yes. I mean, we no longer exist. So, the immediate simplistic answer is yes, it would be the worst thing that could happen to us. And but that leads to all kinds of other questions and all kinds of other ways of thinking about it. I mean, for example, one immediately comes to mind is thinking of the human species as an individual. Myself, I'm a person, and I could ask myself the question: is the worst thing that could happen to me is that I'm going to go extinct, which I am very shortly. I'm 80 years old, so I don't have very much longer to exist. And the answer to that is no, that isn't the worst thing. that could happen to me. And of course, that is partially dependent upon the fact that there are 7 billion others human beings, and that brings up the whole question of what is the meaning of my life, what was the meaning of my life, and what remains the meaning of my life. And that brings up the question of what is the meaning of having human beings in existence on this planet. And I think that divides itself into two things, as it does with a human life. And that is that we are here, of course, in the first instance, because of a bunch of evolutionary processes that led to our existence as just another mammal. But obviously we have very special characteristics and special properties. And in that sense, we have separated ourselves to varying degrees from what is often called sort of the, nature. But one could look into that and see that as a, does that mean that we, I get into dangerous ground here, that there is a purpose in our being the way we are? Because one of the things that we developed was consciousness, not that other organisms, other mammals, even other non-living phenomena may have some form of consciousness, but we have a certain highly developed form of consciousness. And one of the things that has led to, well, two things that has led to, one is, it could be put in terms of, we have ended up being nature's way of knowing itself. That is, we are able to reflect on the thing itself and develop ideas, try to develop an understanding of how it works, bringing a sense of rationality, bringing mathematics to understanding what is the nature of the universe. And that is fantastic. So in a certain sense, a quark or a string or an electron would not know itself if it were not for us, so to speak. So that's one way of looking at it. And that would be a tragedy that that piece of the universe disappears, although very likely there are other parts of the universe, just as there are other human beings beyond me that are maybe also doing this. The other thing that we bring to it that is a cousin of that, I think, which would also be lost, is a sense of morality and ethics. Because this may sound very harsh and it's sort of almost politically incorrect. The rest of the biosphere and the rest of the planet actually doesn't give a damn about what happens. And that's related to consciousness. That is, we do care. I mean, despite the horrible things that go on the planet, we have developed this sense of morality, and we do care, even so that we care about the future of the planet. And in fact, the very sense that you raised the question is an indication of that we're able not only to reflect on our past, but maybe even more importantly, we're able to fantasize about the future and about questions that I think the rest of the natural world does not do. And when we are concerned about horrible things that are going on in Syria, or terrible things that happen because of some natural disaster, the trees that I'm looking out there, or the coyotes and bears that live around here, don't care about that. And so we brought that to the planet. We have brought that, and maybe, for all we know, we brought that to the universe. So in that sense, it would be a tragedy for us to have to lose, for the universe to lose that. So that is predicated on the assumption that matters, and it's predicated on the assumption, to some extent, that there aren't other civilizations across the universe that think in similar ways or have developed even further. and so on. So that's in the realm a little bit of science fiction. But anyway, so that's sort of my immediate answer to the question. By the way, the other thing I would say is that what I'm talking about refers primarily to socioeconomic man and woman. That is the kind of human beings we are that have evolved over the last, especially 10,000 years. Once we became social animals in the sense of forming communities and cities and developed the kind of organizations that we have. And that's, by the way, in terms of your introduction and the kinds of things you're interested in, that is what got me to some extent interested in trying to apply the ideas of physics, if you like, or at least the way of thinking that is engendered by physics to social organization. But anyway, in answer to your question, it's a complicated answer, but in terms of non-socioeconomic man, that is man as an animal in harmony with the rest of nature, which is what we were until possibly 10,000 years ago, but maybe even before that, we'd started to diverge. I don't think it mattered. If human beings were lost then, who cares, so to speak? No one was there to care is part of the point. But it matters less. It's sad in the sense that any species is lost. But I think now I know this is the reason I said not politically correct, because it does make everything in this, for answer to this question, anthropocentric. And I think I don't want to shy away from that. I do think there is something special about how we have evolved over the last 10,000 years.
Sure, no, I agree. It's definitely anthropocentric. And I think one of the reasons I asked the question is because it seems to me, and obviously anybody's free to disagree, but it seems to me if we're given any two sets of ideas that are scientifically plausible or subject to interpretation, but one of them makes it more likely to allow us to live than the other one, it seems logical to say that the one that allows us or leads us to longer life is preferable to one or the set of beliefs that leads us to death.
Sorry.
So that's the reason I asked the question. And it seems to me that because there's so much going on at the cutting edge of virtually every science, and especially, for example, physics, but even in biology and artificial intelligence, it seems to me that one guiding principle that could be helpful to us is the idea that, okay, what does it have to say about some of the very real, very serious threats that we're facing to human existence now? If we can filter those big questions through with this guiding principle, it seems like a useful thing to try to do.
Well, the only comment I'd make on what you said is that, yes, there is this drive to prolong life, that is to maximize lifespan in some sense. But of course, that has to be strongly tempered with quality. One wants the quality of life, both in terms of health span, so to speak, as distinct from lifespan, but also in terms of, for want of a better phrase, meaning. The meaning of life for especially for human beings. It's hard to project onto animals the meaning of life beyond their biological functions. But I think for us, I think we have to temper, as I say, longevity with meaning and kind of self-actualization, for want of a better phrase. So I think that's, and I contemplate that a lot since I'm an old man now. And I think that's true. You could even say about your original question about, the species itself. I think we could think about, when we meet our maker, so to speak, and he asks, have you lived the good life? Or, why didn't you, there's a famous phrase, I think, a rabbinic phrase, or a rabbinic story, where a rabbi was asked, why, when you meet your maker, will you be asked, why didn't you live a life like Moses? The response is no. The real question is, why didn't you live your life like Geoffrey, for example? For me, if I go, why didn't you be Geoffrey? Don't aspire to this. And so really to be yourself. And I think that's a really important thing. And that's true of the species, to be the species. And I think we, in many ways, we have accomplished a great deal despite our tremendous faults.
Very good.
So,
well, thank you very much.
There's this other dimension. In other words, this other dimension, which is very hard for us that are, mathematical quantitative scientists to come to terms with, because very hard to put that into a more analytic kind of framework.
Very good. Well, thank you for your thoughts on that. You brought this up earlier, but the next question are these topics related to your work? And if so, how?
Oh, very much so. Yes, very much so. And in fact, when I wrote my book, I found myself surprisingly at various points just putting in a paragraph here or two that, as thoughts came to me as to, so to speak, sort of the meaning of life. What is all this for? Why are we doing this? Why is it of interest? And so on. But so there was that aspect of it that has always run through my life, in fact. But more specifically, and maybe more within the context of the discussion, is that one of the things that my work on cities and social organizations led me to was, and maybe we could discuss this a little bit more later, or we could go into it now maybe, but led me to beginning to recognize that the mathematical framework, the principles that were behind it, and seeing the consequences of the equations, was that the very dynamic that's led to our great success, that's led to the extraordinary increase in quality and standard of living, on the average, I should say, and the kinds of extraordinary technological accomplishments that we've made, the extraordinary insights into the nature of the world around us and the universe, and the entire universe. The very dynamic that has led to that leads, as far as I can see, inevitably to the eventual collapse of the system, unless we do something extraordinary to intervene. That is, it's got this positive feedback mechanism, which is, it's a classic argument, of course, a kind of Malthusian argument, that of the positive feedback mechanism leading, of course, to faster than exponential growth, and that is not sustainable in a nutshell.
Yes, that's so paradoxical. The idea that our very progress is what is leading to our downfall, if you will.
Yes.
I've argued this about the current situation in the U.S., that it seems to me that the more progress we make, or the more progress we make as a Western civilization, in the principles of the Enlightenment, that is science, progress, freedom, human rights, the more polarized we become as a species. And I think this is quite evident in the US, where 60 or 70 years ago, there was no African Americans in the NBA. There were very few African Americans in, for example, top positions in academia or in Hollywood. Now there's more African Americans with amazing amounts of success. Yet at the same time, arguably, the US is more polarized today than it ever has been in the past. Yes. And it's a very, very strange paradox.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, use. Yes.
No, so one of the things that, yes, of course, it is a great paradox. And one of the things that led me to thinking about this early on in my work was, so what I first entered this kind of work through biology, trying to understand these scaling laws in biology and some of the big picture questions in biology. And one of the things that comes out of this is, in biology, was that systematically the pace of life slows down the bigger you are. So, the image of a ponderous elephant versus a scurrying mouse. And, that's sort of a prediction of the whole framework. So elephants live a long time and mice live very short lives, and so on. So time scales get stretched out, and they get stretched out in a predictable, scalable way. And so that you could rescale everybody to, if you look through the right lens, everybody would live the same length of time, have the same heart rates, and so on. But in fact, we stretch out the metric so that times slow down the bigger you are. And what I discovered by taking the ideas behind that, the mathematical and physical ideas behind that, which were based on underlying structures and dynamics of networks, was that when you applied that to cities and social organizations, we had exactly the opposite effect. So whereas, for example, in biology, the bigger you are, the less energy per capita. So there's an economy of scale. The bigger you are, the less energy a cell is needed, and so forth. You have exactly the opposite in a city, for example. Let me just focus on cities for the moment. The bigger you are, you get the more per capita. You get higher wages, more ideas are generated, and so on. But you also get more disease and crime in a systematic, predictable way. Now, here's what's amazing that goes along with that, also as a kind of 180-degree reflection of biology. Instead of the pace of life slowing down the bigger you are, you're exactly the opposite. The pace of life gets faster the bigger you are in a systematic, predictable fashion. So that, and in particular, one of the most important things is that the rate of innovation in society, as well as just the rate of living in society, has to get faster and faster in order to sustain the system. And all the data supports that very strongly. And so that led me to the idea, now I'm really coming back to answering your question, is that I believe that underlying this malaise that we see in society, and it's particularly evident, I think, in the United States, is this difficulty of adaptation to the increasing pace of life. Because one of the most astonishing things about human beings is that that pace of life has increased inextricably for the last 10,000 years since we formed communities, and of course has accelerated even faster in the last couple of hundred years since the Industrial Revolution. And yet we've been able to adapt to it. I mean, here I am, an old man, and I have to adapt to, the next iPhone, or the next, I had to learn how to use Dropbox, and then Slack, and then it drives me completely nuts. We all know that, I still use an iPhone 6, whereas my children and postdocs are all on iPhones 11. And there's this, and here's the point, that we've had to adapt, and it's remarkable that we've been able to adapt. But we have the same brain and the same biology as we did not just 200 years ago or even 10,000 years ago when all this began, but 100,000 years ago or 1 million years ago, effectively. And that brain has had to adapt at an astonishing rate. And I think that has led, we are now coming to a critical point in this. And I think that one of the consequences of that is this extraordinary deep anxiety and feeling of disconnection, this feeling of alienation that has occurred among many people because they are not able to really adapt or feel threatened, seriously threatened by that that process of adaptation and are being left behind. Because one of the most astonishing things about what we see in the last certainly 10 years, 20 years or so, and especially most recently, is that this phenomenon of kind of authoritarian rule and big swings to kind of right-wing attitudes, a great sense of nostalgia going back to some magical time, Garden of Eden time when everything was perfect. That is not just the United States, that's almost global. So first of all, it's spread everywhere. Secondly, the same phenomena that you see occurring have occurred pretty much in every part of the world. And so it's not it has to have something that transcends what's going on. And the other piece that goes into it, it's rather remarkable that the standard and quality of life has mostly increased monotonically sort of throughout the last century and up through this century. It has, we know, it has to some extent sort of stabilized, but nevertheless, it's increased. Certainly, you know, if I think back 50 years, that you could, by the usual metrics, the usual kind of materialistic metrics, everybody's living at a higher standard of living. All the gadgets and things they have are so much more marvelous and extraordinary than they were then. And yet people are even more dissatisfied. People weren't so dissatisfied then. What was the dissatisfaction? The Vietnam War. Well, that was terrible. But there wasn't this kind of malaise, this deep malaise that seems to be in the spirit and soul of people globally, at least a significant percentage of them. And I believe that it's to do with this phenomenon that we're on this accelerating treadmill and people are not able to keep up and are feeling highly threatened by that. So it's slightly simplistic, and one can go into much more detail about that. But I think that this sense of time, the fact that time is no longer what we thought it was, because we do not live by the astronomical clock. Our time is not really determined by the Earth moving on its axis and revolving around the sun. It's actually determined by socioeconomic activity, by social networks and so on. So this is sort of the framework in which I've been thinking and in which I thought about after much of the work I did, and I kind of speculated about this. And that's in answer to your question. Is that question that you asked about the future of humanity relevant for my work? And the answer is a definite yes.
Very good. Well, thank you for that. There's so many things so many directions we could take with that. I have a question. There are, if I remember right, 7+ billion people on the planet now. Does your work answer the question or help answer the question, what if the vast majority of those numbers of people were to live the lifestyle of Europe and the United States? What would happen? Is it sustainable? Or is that part of your work saying that it's not sustainable?
Well, of course, so let's see. First of all, I think what we'd like, this is sort of a side comment to begin with. Of course, we'd like everybody to live, the 7.5 billion people to live at the kind of level that I assume you and I are able to live, the kind of quality and standard of life. And hopefully that would be also for the 3 to 4 billion that are coming on in the next, 20 to 50 years. I would say that given the situation at the moment in terms of, this is just a simple calculation in terms of the potential supply of energy, that's not possible in the near future. That is desirable and so on, but not possible in the near future. My concern is ironically less about that, which is a major issue, of course, the whole question of inequality and poverty across the globe and so on, but is less about just whether in principle the whole system, socioeconomic system, is at all sustainable. And that goes to things we've already discussed, namely the very dynamic that has led to being able to support 7.5 billion people to varying degrees, and the very dynamic that we hope would lead to all 7.5 billion and eventually 10 or 12 billion, if that is the case, living at a much higher standard of life. That very dynamic has built into it its own demise. And we need to come to terms with that question first, I think. I think that in other words, we need to have a very big sort of grand unified framework for sustainability to answer some of these questions. And one of the problems that has plagued us, I would say continuously, is that we, of course, when we come to talk about any of these issues, we focus in on something very specific without taking into account that everything is interconnected. And one of the things that I learned from my own work was that the very nature of a complex adaptive system is that everything is interconnected. And in fact, I would say one of the great lessons of the pandemic that we're going through is exactly that. I mean, after all, who would have believed that some random mutation of some virus in a far-off city in China would lead to a shortage of flour in the United States, no football in Spain where you are. I mean, no theaters, that people are quarantined, they can't go to restaurants across the globe. Things that seem totally disconnected before this are now all connected because they all have their origin in this. And this is, of course, as I've called it, the mother of all butterfly effects. Some small change in the system in one part is exponentiated everywhere, but is exponentiated across things that a priori one didn't think were connected. And the point is, they were connected, of course. That was the point, that we should have recognized that all of these things are connected. In some weird way, the continuation of having football matches is connected to the shortage of yeast and flour. Because it's all once, of course, in a stable state, it's very short range. You don't see those connections. But in general, as you approach any critical point, you have these long range order effects because they can conceivably be connected, and they are. So I think we need to develop a much more holistic, systemic way of thinking about these problems before in conjunction with, obviously you can't, it's not something one does sequentially, but we need to be doing that as we answer these questions.
Very good. Well, can you elaborate on this idea that it's not sustainable, the current growth laws that we're on, and in what sense is it not sustainable, or what's going to happen? What are the threats that we're facing?
Well, let's see. Let me see where I want to begin. So I said earlier that the dominant feature of social organizations is derived from the dynamics of social networks. And the dynamics of social networks have a very special property. They have built into them positive feedback mechanisms, because A talks to B, B talks to C, C talks back to A, and we have this, a building of ideas. And in fact, the whole point of a city, the reason cities have been the most extraordinary machine the man has invented is because that is a machine for facilitating and enhancing those social interactions, social networks, and therefore that positive feedback mechanism. That's why we have sports stadiums and lecture halls and universities and so on, to encourage that. And great cities have informal places to do that, squares in the city and parks and little coffee shops and things to enhance social interactions, to create ideas. And most of those ideas are irrelevant to most other people and are not very interesting. But every once in a while, that dynamic leads to the theory of relativity, or string theory, or the invention of Amazon or Google or the internet. That's the process. And that's the city is the machine for enhancing that. Now that positive feedback mechanism leads to some extraordinary consequences. And that is that it leads to this kind of superlinear scaling of cities. That is, if you plot any socioeconomic metric versus size of a city, what you see is that, first of all, it follows a very simple scaling law. And that's, by the way, a reflection of the kind of systematic structure of social networks, that they follow simple scaling laws, which are simple power laws, whose exponents are bigger than 1. That's the superlinear. And that means the bigger you are, the more you have per capita. So as I said earlier, the more ideas, the more wealth, the higher wages, and so on and so forth. And that's great. And what that leads to, if you ask then the question of the time development of that system, what you find is something very satisfactory. And that is that if you put that into a growth equation, you find that instead of having what you see in biology, that you grow quickly and then stop, and that cessation of growth, that sigmoidal kind of curve, the boundedness of growth that we have in biology, which arises from the sublinear behavior of metabolic rate in organisms. Here we have the opposite. The superlinear behavior gives rise to open-ended growth. So it's great. So you have a really a very self-consistent, lovely mathematical structure based on principles. Positive feedback mechanism in social networks leads to superlinear scaling in terms of the growth of a city, and that leads to open-ended growth, which is what we see, and that's great. The problem with that are two things. One is, I've already just emphasized, it leads to the increasing pace of life. That positive feedback mechanism speeds everything up in a systematic way. And secondly, it leads to a finite time, what's called a finite time singularity. The equations are, for those that are technically oriented, is a logistic kind of equation, and technically it leads to a finite time singularity, which in English simply means that in some finite time, even though you have open-ended growth, this growth has to become infinite, which is obviously crazy. You can't have an infinite GDP or an infinite number of AIDS cases or infinite number of ideas being generated. So, and the equations tell you what happens. It says the system will collapse. And that is sort of a sophisticated version of the Malthusian argument. Now, the way out of this is very clear, and was the great criticism of Malthus early on in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and through the 20th century. The criticism of Malthusian thinking was that the way out of this is you haven't taken into account innovation, because that idea that it just has open-ended growth is based on the idea that sort of the parameters stay fixed. And of course, you can change the parameters and so the boundary conditions by making a major innovation, shifting the paradigm, sort of reinventing yourself, and you sort of start over again. So it's like, if you discover coal, or you discovered, in earlier days, iron, and more recently you invent computers, or you discover the internet. This completely changes things and effectively starts the system over again. So that's the that was the argument that was used in the 19th and 20th centuries to say you can completely ignore the problems of exponential growth because we're going to innovate our way out of it. And that's what we've done. We've done it brilliantly, may I say. And that's great. But in this framework that I described based on networks and is very much a physicist approach because it's quantitative, analytic, it's compared to data, is that in this framework, the problem is that everything speeds up. And one of the things that economists haven't taken into account is not only that time is accelerating, but you have to innovate faster and faster. So, so something that might have taken 100 years to really develop 1,000 years ago now takes 15 years. And soon it's going to have to take 12 years and then 10 years and so on. So you take that reductio ad absurdum, and what you have is that the system is simply not sustainable. In other words, what you'd have to have is you'd have to have, in 10, 15 years, another major innovation equivalent to the internet. And then 5 to 10 years later, another major innovation equivalent to what's happened with the internet. And that is just not, it's almost inconceivable that you can sustain that, so to speak, ad infinitum. Whereas so in other words, the idea that innovation falsifies the Malthusian argument, and by the way, the arguments that were made in the 1970s, especially when the environmental movement came along, were some famous proposals that the system was not sustainable based on population dynamics, Paul Ehrlich being the famous one, population bomb, the Club of Rome with their studies at MIT and so on. All those did not take into account innovation, so they were dismissed effectively. So, but here the idea is, yes, the innovation does reset the clock, but it's only a postponement. It doesn't solve the problem. And in fact, you're going to have to do it again very soon, and then you're going to have to do it even sooner, and so on. And it leads to essentially this pileup of singularities.
So what does that mean in terms of, in practical terms that we can understand? Is this part of what's leading to some of the social and political difficulties?
That is my speculation, is that exactly that is what we're sensing collectively, is this phenomenon, this increasing pace of life, this increasing pressure to continually innovate and to change things, trying to keep up with everything. I mean, my image is that we're on this treadmill that is accelerating. It's going faster and faster, and that's bad. But then every once in a while, we have to jump from that treadmill to another treadmill that's going faster and faster. And then we have to jump from that one to another one that's going faster and faster. And we have to do these jumps at a faster and faster rate. And eventually we're going to have a socioeconomic heart attack. So that's kind of the image that I have in mind. And if you're in that situation collectively, that is inevitably going to produce a great sense of anxiety, because the difficulties of keeping up with the problem of adaptation. I mean, I'm probably one of the last generations that grew up really with, if I'd given it any thought, was that the world will look, yes, there are going to be changes in my lifetime and things will be invented and so on, but basically it's going to be exactly the same. I mean, I'm going to enter a job, I'm going to be in the same job, the structures are going to look the same and so on and so forth. And that is certainly not the case any longer. Just in my short lifetime, where the planet has gone up by, just in terms of population, has gone up by 3.5 times in the population, which is extraordinary. But the changes have been phenomenal. And so, to adapt to that is extremely difficult, especially if you are only having even a modest income, let alone being in poverty. And especially as things are changing and you're disenfranchised, you don't feel you're part of it, and so on. And so if you ask what will happen, I think, is that one would see increasing social unrest.
Sure, that makes sense.
And also, you would also, I suppose, might even predict that you'd see more authoritarian rule, because people look for simplistic solutions and leaders who will promise that, yes, we can fix all this. And also, especially in terms of some of the leaders we've had on the planet in recent years, and that is that, look, I'm going to take you back to a time when it was simpler. I'm going to revert, I mean, they don't use these words, but I'm going to try to reverse the clock, reverse what's going on, so that the pace of life will be slower, you can adapt quicker, and so on. That's, in a certain sense, the message they're trying to portray. Make America great again is sort of trying to go back to 1950s, where everything was looking rosy and everything seemed simple and so on. Of course, it wasn't. I mean, that's the other great irony. There were other kinds of problems. But nevertheless, I think that's part of the kind of socio-psychology that's going on that arises from this accelerating pace of life, which has arisen, just to repeat again, from this the positive feedback in social networks that has led to our great success. So,
Sure.
So it does beg the question: is there a way out of this?
That was my next question. What? How in the world do we get out of this
So
loop?
I must tell you that I am, by nature, in these terms, a sort of naive, positive person. I mean, if I become schizophrenic and I sort of put aside my physicist, rational, analytic way of thinking and just let me be just some emotional person, I'm sort of like a Republican. That is, yes, all very well, all this science and so on, but look, we'll find a way out of it. It'll just, it'll all work itself out. We shouldn't worry about such things. So that's sort of who I am by nature in a certain way. By the way, I'm a liberal, a far liberal Democrat in terms of my politics. But I do have that side to me that also sees that other reflection of, look, we've always worked it out, and we'll work it out again. I think that's wrong. I think the evidence strongly points against that, and that there is this interminable, inextricable dynamic at work, and so having another major innovation is not going to solve it; it's going to postpone it. What I said before, and that leads, and so therefore I became quite pessimistic when I sort of started to speculate. And I want to emphasize, this is obviously speculation at this level. But when I speculated about that, I became quite pessimistic and almost depressed about in terms of the future, the long-term future.
So your work does not point to a possible solution or a way out of this.
So that's what I'm coming to. So I started thinking, and then I realized, as one often does in science, that I hadn't been broad enough in my thinking. That is, when I said innovation, and here's the point. What I realized was I was using the word innovation the way it is now used in the popular press and certainly in normal conversation, and that is that it's technological. I mean, we're dominated by IT and Silicon Valley, and somehow innovation somehow is associated with something that's technological. And all the work on innovation that I put into my work, my own work, I'm not an expert on innovation itself, but I use the data from those that have worked on it, are all to do with technological innovations. And the predictions of the work that I've done agrees very well with the work that people have done on innovation. So I'm very happy with that. But I realized that we always define it now in terms of technological innovation. And I realized, my goodness me, that's not what innovation is that, but it's much broader than that. Because obviously there's other kinds of innovation, like cultural innovation, social innovation, political innovation. And indeed, I realized that in terms of Mr. Trump, because Mr. Trump was well, let me back off again a second. So I thought, yes, so obviously one of the ways out of this is a cultural innovation, a cultural paradigm shift, which of course people in one form or another have been talking about, in terms we do have to change the way we think about things and deal with the world in terms of our propensity for getting more, wanting more, the propensity for needing another car or a new refrigerator when the old one is working perfectly well, that kind of phenomenon, to sort of change our way of thinking. So we need something like that. We need some major cultural innovation. And then I was amazingly, I know this sounds weird, heartened by the election of Mr. Trump. I know not because of what he represents, because of the phenomenon. Here's the point. When I thought about cultural innovation, I thought, shit, you know, those take decades, you know, for people to really change. And I do think that's probably true. They take decades. There are counterexamples a little bit, like cigarette smoking. It took a while, but it did happen fairly quickly, seatbelts and so on. These are small things. But Trump was extraordinary because in a matter of less than a year, somehow the culture went from believing in science and rational thinking. We all agree on certain facts. We agree on certain ways of doing things. We have certain ethics, certain morals. To suddenly all of that being thrown out of the window and going back to sort of pre-Enlightenment way of acting, at least my image of it. And suddenly he'd let loose something, of course, that was always there, because it is there, this kind of irrational thinking, a kind of anger about science, anger about technology, anger about moving towards the future, a rejection of facts, and just sort of making things up as you go along. Suddenly that became a norm for a significant portion of the population, and not just in the United States. Again, I want to emphasize, this was a global phenomenon. It had its biggest impact in the United States, primarily because the United States is one of the biggest countries and the most powerful. But it did happen, and I thought, my God, that is extraordinary. In less than a year, something that we've taken for granted for several hundred years suddenly gets thrown out of the window. And we're, you know, so this indicated that maybe one could make a dramatic cultural change in a relatively short period of time. Maybe not a year, but less than decades. And, but I also recognized something that again, total speculation, but maybe we have to accept that you need leadership. That yes, there's grassroots and it happens collectively, ultimately, but you need leadership and you need political leadership. And one of the things I've had to face in my own work is that I could do all this wonderful work as far as I'm concerned. It's wonderful, I enjoy it, and it does have certain implications. But in the end, it's a political problem. And unless you have leadership of some kind in the social sphere, nothing will happen. And Trump was someone that focused on that. And everywhere people were able to focus, because all these things were here. All this irrationality was of course, is already there. We know that. It's that the good dominates the bad, so to speak, in society. That's the rule of law and the rule of ethics and morals. Hopefully, dominates society to a greater and lesser extent. That's how we function. Otherwise, we couldn't function. But he let loose the forces of evil, as far as I'm concerned. And partly because of this huge frustration that I described earlier. So that led me to the idea that, what's going to have to happen to get out of this is that we need the right kind of leadership. Of course, that's depressing because we don't.
That's so. Can I pause for a moment there? I just like to emphasize how much I agree with you on that. I think you're absolutely right. We just need the right kind of leadership. So,
yeah, we just don't have that kind of charismatic. I mean, Trump is, you may very much dislike him, but he is charismatic to a lot of people. And you need that. You need, how shall I say it? You sort of need a Jesus Christ or a Buddha or a Martin Luther King, or, you need someone that somehow people are able to channel, project onto, and allow the good, love, and the desire for collective, the greater collective good, altruism, to really dominate over me, I want more, greed, which we all have. I mean, there's no question that there's a part of me, my God, I live in a lovely house, I have more than one car, and so on. It's completely nuts. So we're all part of that. But I do hope that the The good, the part that's going to contribute to the solution to this, dominates. And someone needs to do that.
Well, those are all very, very interesting points. I'd like to try to connect our conversations so far back to the physics and to one possible path that might be interesting for us to think about. And it has to do with symmetry. Can I ask you,
Yes.
we both know that symmetry, of course, has played a really important role in the history and development of physics. Is there a connection between your work on scaling and the concept of symmetry?
Yes, yes, there is. Yes, this is also a very big question. And I'm glad you brought us back to physics, because I want to emphasize again that, I'm out of my depth in the last part in terms of the extrapolation from my own work into the political social realm.
I'm sorry, may I pause? One of the reasons that I feel that your work is so important is precisely because I think there is a connection, and your courage to venture out and cross that chasm that has existed until now, I think is one of the reasons that your work is so important. So I'd like to respectfully differ with you on that and say that your physics work and it's the extrapolation to society and to these big philosophical questions is precisely what we need. We need to make those connections.
No, I agree with you. I just wanted to put in a caveat that I shouldn't be considered an expert, but I do agree with you that whether it's me or someone else, we need to step up to the plate, so to speak, and we need to now be part of the solution in terms of these big questions for society. And I think, especially in the United States now with a change of regime, and that science will again be appreciated, I'm hoping that there will be people stepping up in the scientific sphere to lead the charge for dealing with some of these questions. And by the way, I just have a side comment on that. One of the things, sadly, that has happened in the physics and scientific community is there are very few people that are able to do this, and partially because we don't have people that are thinking big enough, in my opinion. We still are focused on solving one problem at a time, which is 90% of what we have to do, of course, but we need sort of a small percentage that are thinking more globally, so to speak. Anyway, I'm sorry. Let's go back to the symmetry. Let's go back to
no. That's quite all right. In fact, this is one of the reasons that I launched this channel, is to take on these questions. And in fact, my first initial question is precisely geared toward this issue of why are there so many absolutely brilliant people? Some of the most talented intellectuals on the planet are, of course, go into physics and other branches of science, yet we're on the verge of destroying ourselves.
Yes. No, it
doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense.
Yes, it's a
dilemma. And if one thing that if there's one way that I'd like to contribute to this whole conversation, or this mess that we're in as a species, is, wait a minute, why aren't the brightest people tackling this question? It's the most important question. I think it's really, really important.
Agree. I say that, by the way, when I give talks as physics colloquia, I try to say that actually, because this is again a kind of side comment, but it is a little bit related to it. Especially in the time I came through the system, so to speak, as a student, postdoc, young professor, and so on, in high energy physics. Definitely the culture was that, of course, this is the most fundamental of all sciences. These are the building blocks of everything. And really, that's all you need to know. Once you have the fundamental equations, then, of course, you can understand everything from the origins and evolution of the universe, to the forming of galaxies, to planets, and ultimately of life, and therefore of everything around us. And that's just engineering. It's just sort of turning the crank. And so the only important thing is focusing on the fundamental question of elementary particles and their interactions. And I'm afraid that still persists in one form or another in the high energy physics community for sure, but across many other basic research communities, even though they're doing brilliant research and extraordinary things are happening. So I'm in no way criticizing the work, quite the contrary. I think it's even more extraordinary than I experienced in my own career. So, but I am concerned that this connection to the bigger picture, and the thing I often emphasize is, you know, to me, the two most fascinating questions intellectually are, of course, the big questions of the elementary particles and the question of the origins and nature of the universe. But the one that's equally, and in some ways more so, is the messiness that's on this planet. I mean, that life began, that, you know, when you look around at the extraordinary diversity and the extraordinary things that happened on this planet, that is probably in some ways more crucial and equally fundamental as understanding a theory of everything. And that was a huge, it sounds simplistic, but that was a huge revelation to me as I moved out of high energy physics. That because I did have this attitude that even though it was implicit, it wasn't explicit, that was the only thing that mattered, was kind of getting a grand unified theory or a theory of everything. Anyway, that's right. An aside. That's an aside. I want to go back to this question of symmetry because I think it's a very interesting question of itself, because symmetry, and it's related to what I said, to what I just said. In fundamental physics, symmetry, as you said, plays a crucial central role. I mean, it's in one form or another, not just geometric symmetry, but just having invariance. I mean, the idea of invariance, something that doesn't change when you change something else, which is a symmetry in a certain sense. And that's crucial. I mean, all our equations sort of can be related to concepts like that. And it's quite fantastic, I think, and beautiful.
Yes, I agree. So in this regard, I have a very humble proposal for us to think about going forward, and that the idea of symmetry and physics and society. In physics, of course, we know that attraction and repulsion are some of the most, or two of the most fundamental, if not the most fundamental phenomena in nature. Is that the case? Attraction, gravity, and repulsion, dark energy. So is there, or might there be a symmetry between this gravitational nature of the universe and the dark energy that is making the universe expand, and the moral attraction and repulsion that people feel? Is there a symmetry or a potential symmetry between that? Because if there is, then it has important implications for how we get along as humans, because politics, in some sense, is about being attracted toward one way of believing or one belief system about the future versus being repulsed by another idea. Do you think that this might be an interesting avenue to pursue?
Well, I think it is, expanding that a little more broadly. There have been various attempts to kind of model human interaction or social networks on kind of physics, similar things to what you were talking about. You know, you could even have the analog to Feynman diagrams, you know, that in terms of interactions and forming collectives or forming condensed states and so on, as well as, you know, repulsion and attraction in terms of various codes of social behavior. I've not worked on those. I've thought about it some, and there are, of course, so I'm not really in a position to argue one way or the other whether, something, I see them, I don't see them in the way I think you're proposing, that is a little bit in the sense of causal, that they sort of causally go down. I see them much more, even though that may be right, I see them much more as metaphors, that metaphorically.
No, I don't see it as causal either, by the way. No, I don't see it as causal.
Okay.
I just see it as symmetry, in the same way that your scaling laws go up from the microscopic level up through the macroscopic level.
Yes.
There's a symmetry or a scaling law. I don't think it's causal either, but it's.
Oh, very good. No, so I use the word metaphor more, but it can go much stronger than metaphor. And in some of the work I did, it was in the sense that it's the same principles apply at a microscopic level as actually applying at a macroscopic level, and they manifest themselves somewhat similarly, even though the structures are quite different.
Sure.
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 A human being is not a cell, but nevertheless, they can obey similar laws.
Sure. Well, let's follow that. If we follow that same line of thinking, whether metaphorical or mathematical, the word, I think, in this case is less important than the actual understanding. We previously called for a need for leadership, right? We need the right kind of leaders. So if we think of the solar system as a society, then the sun would be the right kind of leader, or at least the leader that keeps the solar system in harmony, right? So there's a mathematical relationship between the sun and the earth and the rest of the planets. So can't we not think about how this mathematics might have implications for how we make decisions and how we govern our cities and nations? And more concretely, in terms of political theory. Imagine giving the sun and the moon one vote to decide who revolves around who.
Yes.
It doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I understand. Yes, I don't know. I don't know whether I'd have to think more seriously about that, to whether that it's a useful, I use the word metaphor again, to do that. Of course, human beings have done that, of course, in terms of the sun. I mean, sun worshippers, the sun god, and so on, seeing the sun as the dominant force, which it is, of course. It is the dominant force. One of the things we've forgotten on this planet, in fact, is that we're only here because of the sun, and we're only sustained because of the sun. And in the last 200 years, one of the things that we have forgotten in the last 200 years is that the role of the sun, because we discovered fossil fuels, stored energy from the sun, but not recognized that it was from the sun. And it's led to this extraordinary explosion, was the exploitation of that. But what we need to do is return, of course, in a certain sense, to recognizing that the sun is the origin of all our energy and therefore of all life, and see it as the dominant force in the sustainability of everything that's around us. So in that sense, I agree with you. Whether you can take it, a little more realistically or a little more physically, so to speak, I'm not so sure. But but in that sense, it's absolutely, the sun should be given lots of votes.
Sure. Sure. No, I mean, what I meant in the sense that applied the math, because there's apply the math to, there's some people that should have more authority, like we said earlier, should have more of a leadership role in the way societies are governed. So if you give somebody...
Yes, I mean, the thing, it's a delicate balance, of course, between, on the one extreme, authoritarian rule, and on the other, benevolent, insightful, inspired leadership. And, that's the struggle that continues. But that's the kind of thing that we need. It doesn't have to be political, of course. It can be cultural and social and so on, or intellectual. But it's, it's not simple. It's easy to say that, but it's certainly not simple. But we do need, going back to what we discussed earlier, we do need some sense of leadership, some sense of inspiration and passion for the forces of good, and for the want of a better word, love and altruism that has been missing, I think, for quite a while on the planet. So, by the way, I have to stop very shortly, I'm afraid, within 10 minutes.
Sure.
So,
sure. I want to be respectful of your time. I want to ask one last question. Some time has passed since you wrote your scaling book on the universal laws of growth. Is there anything that you would change going back, or how do you feel about the book today? How has it been received?
Yeah, good question. That's so the book got very good press, and was, quote, a bestseller in its various sections and so on. So I did very well. But I might do it differently. Originally it was supposed to be a book about half the size of what it was, and probably less broad. And I made a decision up front that originally, as well, by the way, I was going to put in a little mathematics, and I was going to have appendices with some of the mathematics in it, or at least put it on supplementary material on the web for people to look at. But as I began to write it, I realized I don't want to frighten any audience. And two things I want to do is to have no mathematics and try to explain things without any mathematics. And also, I'm not going to shirk from explaining. That is, I'm going to try to explain everything I write down in English, so to speak, which is very difficult. And in some cases, I think I succeeded very well. In other cases, I'm sure I failed badly. But it did get very positive feedback overall, and it's done very well. It's been translated in languages across the globe, and that's been very nice. But the one thing I did begin to realize in a certain naivete, I sort of wanted to give this big picture of everything in there. And in fact, by the way, originally I had in mind putting in high energy physics and the theory of everything in the same book. To link it up a little bit along the lines we've been talking, to link the whole thing up.
Well, I've always felt that a theory of everything has to be a theory of literally everything if it's going to.
Yeah, so that was the idea.
Yeah,
could I link it up to string theory eventually? That was what I had in mind. And the renormalization group and all kinds of things I had. Anyway, I cut that out because it was getting too big and too long, and I didn't think I could do it successfully. But having said that, one of the things I discovered is that my book addresses communities that are quite disparate. Everything from, individual stovepipe academic communities, biology, physics, social sciences, urban science, and so on, to the business and corporate community and political community. And all of them have responded to me in some way. But I believe the book would have had even bigger impact, or much bigger impact, had I split it into pieces, done what I did not want to do. I wanted to provide an integration, but it loses a certain impact. And I was reminded of it just this very morning on the web when I learned that, what was the magazine? One of the major business magazines in the United States, which is an international magazine, I forget which one it was. It turns out wanted to made one of these articles about the 10 or whatever it is, 15 top business books, because it says hundreds of these books are published every year. No one, what are the ones that you should read that are really important? And they asked top CEOs, and mine was among them.
That's fantastic.
Was a business book. And in fact, the year it was published, it was in the top 10 of business. And the comment was, this is not actually a business book. This is actually a science book, but it explains more more about business and how my company is run than any of the business books I've read. And so, that just reminded me that, that's great. I was very flattered and it's great for my ego and so on. But it reminded me, what a shame in a way. I could have written a book that was more focused on the business community. I could have written a book that's more focused on people that are interested in aging and mortality and so on. And so I'm schizophrenic about this. I'm in two minds. That should I have kept it the way it is, which is in fact much more true to my nature, by the way it is, than really getting maybe a much bigger audience by having deconstructed it in some way. And one of the things I'm vaguely thinking about is, I can't do it now, but would I write another book that would try to do more of that, would be a little more focused, and in fact on some of the things we talked about. Because one of the things I didn't do at the end of the book is where I got into this question of global sustainability, touching on some of the things we talked about earlier. I left the argument hanging by letting people draw their own conclusions as to, is the planet sustainable and what should you do? I did not. I sort of left out half a chapter purposely. And maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I should have let my hair down and further and really speculated. And I was reminded, by the way, in writing the book, I know this is terrible, I feel immodest making a comparison, but one of the great books in science that doesn't get the sort of the recognition it should, even though it's highly recognized, is Newton's book on optics, his book on optics, which in fact is much more philosophical than, the Principia or any of the other things that he wrote. It's especially at the beginning and the end. And in the end, he really lets his hair down and starts talking about, the nature of the universe and so on and so forth. And I felt I didn't do that. And I should have done. I should have taken a cue from Newton and been a little more willing to let go of my deep sense of the need for scientific rigor. So I don't know. It's a hard question. You've touched on something that I struggle with, frankly, and I think about, did I make a mistake in shoving everything into this great big bloody book?
Well, despite your misgivings, you've written an amazing book, and I think it's a very, very important work. I hope people will read it and take it seriously. And Professor, I want to be respectful of your time. Yes, thank you very, very much for spending so much of it with me today. I wish you the best, and thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Luis. I appreciated the conversation. You had excellent questions, and I very much enjoyed our discussion.